Hey everyone, it's Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest. I am here today with Vanessa Leiby. She is the Executive Director of the Water and Wastewater Equipment Manufacturers Association. We had her on not too long ago, and we wanted to talk a little bit more with her about the American Iron and Steel Act and the Buy America language that we're hearing about in the latest infrastructure bill and the impacts that could have on the water and the wastewater industry. So Vanessa, thank you for being back on to the program. We really appreciate getting your insights.
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here, Bob. Thanks for the invitation.
So yeah, like I said, when we last talked, we talked a lot about a lot of things going on in Washington, but this time we're going to be a little more focused. One of the things that we talked about last time was this American Iron and Steel Act, Buy America language, and how that's impacting, especially for you, manufacturers, but at a grander scale, what that means then for engineers buying and specifying things, and for projects trying to get federal funding. So there's a lot of elements to this, and we're going to try and provide some educational knowledge. Could you explain, I guess, from the baseline, what is American Iron and Steel and the American Iron and Steel Act, and what is Buy American, and like how do they differ, or how similar are they?
So I think that's the best question to really start with because it's a very complex question that we're trying to understand the pieces and parts. And so there's really three major pieces of legislation that we're looking at when we look at the full picture of what all of this means. And we start way back with the Buy American Act, and that's got the N, and that was
Okay.
passed in 1933. And that actually deals with direct federal procurement processes for public projects. So 100% of the materials have to be manufactured in the U.S. with at least, and this was back at that time with at least 50% domestic content, and now that's been increased to 55%. There certainly were some waiver options back then, but this is really direct federal procurement. So that's one way we have to look at it Buy American. The one thing that I do want to share, though, when we hear a lot of the congressional folks up on the Hill talk about this, is over time, the federal government itself has put in a whole lot of carve outs and exemptions and waivers so that they can comply with their own requirements. So there's commercially available off the shelf products that don't have to comply. There's IT, the whole area of IT doesn't have to comply with Buy American. There's agreements with all of our allied trading partners that are considered equivalents, so they can be sourced in other countries around the world. And the other issue is that there's really very minimal to almost no tracking, reporting, validation on that process. So Buy American is not the gold standard here if you're looking at ensuring everything is produced and made in the U specifically in the US. So I think that's important to understand. The next piece of legislation is the Buy America Act, and that's without the N. And that was passed in 1982 as part of the Surface Transportation Assistance Act. And that specifically deals with federal flow down of taxpayer dollars. So this is to state and local governments, federal entities. And these also had similar but different requirements, and they primarily are dealing with the highways, railways, bridges, mass transit. Each of those federal agencies has their own interpretation and their own way of complying, shall we say, with the requirements. So it gets complicated very quickly.
Yeah, really
So
murky.
now we're going to go to what applies to us right now, which is the American Iron and Steel requirements. And those came into effect for the water sector in 2014 as part of the consolidated appropriations process. So for some amount of time, particularly on drinking water, it would have to be reapproved and as part of the appropriations process on an annual basis. So it's now been made permanent for the Clean Water SRF, and it's been made permanent for WIFIA, and it's temporarily permanent for the Drinking Water SRF until September 30th, 2023. So there were a number of different pieces of legislation that impacted that. So right now, the AIS really just applies to the clean water and drinking water SRFs and the WIFIA program.
Okay.
And what Congress did was they specified in legislation the exact products that were going to be impacted by this. And they were iron and steel products. So manhole covers, pipe, rebar, hydrants, tanks, flanges, valves. And then they had a list of construction materials. But they were really iron and steel products. So what the AIS does not cover is anything mechanical or electrical in nature. So it's pumps, motors, VFDs, mixers, gates, screens, blowers and aerators, membrane filtration systems. So the very complex kinds of manufactured, but obviously everything's manufactured. I always kind of chuckle about that. You know, everything's made,
Yeah.
but we talk about manufactured goods. But what we're really talking about, I think, are really complex systems that have multiple different components that all have to be brought together in order for that aeration system to function as an aeration system. So,
Yeah.
so those have not been under the umbrella of the American Iron and Steel requirements to date. And that's the major concern we have shifting to the Senate infrastructure language and the bill that was recently passed, is it very broadly expands what I would call the Buy American federal requirements to all federal agencies, all federal direct and all federal indirect dollars. And in the case of EPA, it would go beyond the SRFs and the WIFIA to any grant, loan, or project funding that they may have for stormwater, water reuse, lead service line replacement, but those would be pipes anyway. But it really impacts everything. And it doesn't have the carve-outs that the federal government has created for itself to be able to comply with Buy American. So that's the big concern that we have right now with, particularly with that expansion. So I'll stop there. I know there's other questions you want to ask.
Yeah, well, that's a great baseline for us to understand that just the far-ranging impacts of it, both directly and indirectly. I think it's really the aspect of complexity of the equipment produced as well, how that impacts things, which I'm sure we'll touch on as well. But how let's break it out so that we can talk about one and the other. Let's start with American Iron and Steel. What impact has that had on manufacturers and manufacturing and even sourcing? I imagine then you suddenly have to source things a little bit differently as well.
Mm-hmm. So it had a fairly immediate impact, specifically for those products.
Mm-hmm.
So some of our manufacturers could comply immediately because they had relationships with foundries and steel mills here that they could source, directly, and they were fine. Others, they had to bring that supply chain back here, and they had to find and develop those relationships, which will take time, right? And you kind of go to the back of the line when you're the new kid on the block. So, they found themselves sort of having to buy for, finite capacity for those that had already had those well-established relationships. So we've managed to deal with this over the last 7 years and deal with it in the sense that it starts at the local level with the community and their engineering consulting firm. Some of them had to re-engineer their projects and products so that they would use an alternate piece of equipment or component, maybe not the same caliber, but it would work. We do know that some projects kind of just got stalled and stopped. We know certainly the costs of components went up and costs of projects. And the challenge for us is the way that the language is written. People say, well, there's this 25% waiver, but it's 25% on the total cost of the project. So if you have a multi-million-dollar wastewater treatment project and your component's $100,000 or something, you're never going to exceed 25% of the total cost of the project. So it wasn't the product, it was the project. So that's a farce. That's really never going to be used. Let's be real about that. And so that was a challenge. And we still, even to this day, 7 years later, see that there are products that still are not available here. And they're more finite, but when you listen to folks that say, build it and they will come, well, we now know after 7 years, we still can't source things, but that hasn't created the marketplace for those components now to be able to be made here. And those are typically like butterfly valves, stainless steel ball valves, swing check valves, some bolts and fittings and things like that. And part of the challenge for us is we're not doing metric tons of rolling stock coming off out of the foundry. We're doing very specialized, highly specific, engineered and processed components for a specific project and a specific utility. So we don't have stockpiles of materials in pumps, because they're different sizes, they're different, tolerance needs. Everything's very specific to the design of the project. So we don't have huge capacity muscle to go into a foundry or someone and say, hey, put us to the front of the line, because we're not. Yeah. We're not able to do that. So we've managed to address this. We haven't used a whole lot of waivers. I mean, you can go to EPA's website and see those waivers. They're posted. There's a multi-level process from going to the utility, to the state, to the federal government, to public outreach, to all of us disseminating out. Can you guys find this product? Here's some business opportunity. If you can provide this, go for it. And so we still see that there are some products that are not manufactured here.
What about on the Buy American side of things, now with this recent potential for expansion, what kind of impact would that have? Because it sounds like
okay, what? That is going to be a disaster.
Okay.
And we're just going to say that. One of the concerns that we have is, if you read the legislation, it sounds, first off, they want each of the federal agencies to develop a report about what their domestic content requirements are. And if they don't meet the exact criteria of what's laid out in the legislation, they're considered deficient programs. So each agency has to identify what their deficiencies are. So in our case, a big piece of that would be what we would call manufactured goods, or the complex motorized electrical goods. Those currently are not covered. But the way, if I'm reading it correctly, the way the language states in the Senate bill is that compliant and deficient programs all have to be able to be compliant fully within 6 months of enactment of the law. 6 months is not adequate time at all to reshore, change your supply chains, find domestic capacity, develop those relationships, get in line, and have your products made here. It's not. So, yeah. and then on the flip side, you'll hear folks say, well, there's a waiver process. But they've also created the Made in America office, where they're centralizing all of the waiver approvals, and have made it very clear they don't want to issue waivers. So it's really a catch-22. And frankly, we don't want to have to go through the waiver process. It's time consuming, it's costly, it delays projects, it potentially increased costs. We're not looking for that out. We're looking to be able to comply. And looking at what the federal government is the standard it's holding itself to. And so, at a minimum, what we're, trying to think through is, can we at least get the trade agreements piece in? Because we're talking about companies that are, huge global companies in some cases. We have a global supply chain. It
Mhm.
is a global world. And it's probably not practical to assume that everything is going to be able to be made here, whether it's a good thing or not. We're not going to argue that, but it's not practical.
Mhm.
And so, we're sourcing from Germany, from Sweden, from Canada. I mean, these are our legitimate trade, WTO, GPA trading allies.
Mhm.
And they've been acceptable to the American government under Buy American. And so it only seemed appropriate that can continue on, and at least at some level of time, to see if we can even get some of these supply chains rerouted back here
Mhm.
and ensure that we have capacity. And I raised this earlier, it's not that it's just us as a standalone sector that's trying to independently comply. We're now going to be competing with the roads, bridges, mass transit, who have billions of dollars of new money that they want to get in line to spend, and they're going to be in the front. I mean, there's
Yeah.
just no question about that.
Yeah. And that kind of leads to the next question that I had, which is kind of like, so we have this direct impact on these manufacturers, and then that creates this indirect impact on the utilities trying to get the products that they're selling and use them for their
Right.
projects. You talked about too that like this challenge of the we know about this infrastructure bill, right? And the size of our funding pool versus the size of the transportation, like you said, really creates this unequal competitive landscape essentially in how that money can be allocated. Well, what impact does this then indirectly have on utilities? Is it just all like is it like delaying timelines of projects? Is it
I
finding
think it's going
difficulty
to
even
be,
getting the products? Like what
well,
are
we
the
already know
major
that the
challenges?
supply, we already, sorry to interrupt. We already know that the supply chain has been disrupted for the last 2 years, and it's not necessarily getting any better. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better if everything's made here either. You still have to find the components and raw goods and things like that. Um, so I think it's delays in projects. I think it's increased costs, because
Hmm.
some of the other things that the federal government has done in their direct procurement under Buy American is they've added percentage of value add to American products. So they would say, okay, if the foreign product equivalent is 25% less expensive, and the federal government is still, it's not value-based procurement, it's least cost, right? And that's another complaint we have, is that they're not looking for the best product, they're looking for the cheapest product. And so then what they do is they add a premium onto the foreign product to now make the American product affordable and maybe lowest price. But now you're passing on that premium of 25 or 30% to your end user, the utility.
Hmm.
So there's no big win-wins here. It's complex, it's challenging, it's something that we need to understand the ramifications to. We're not saying it's a bad thing, but we're just saying, let's look at how these laws have been put in place, how they've been implemented, and make sure that, because we're talking public health and environmental protection here, I mean, that this is significant
Hmm.
for the water sector. And we have to be able to source and provide those technologies in a timely and cost-effective way, so that we can ensure that continued protection of
Yeah.
our citizens and our environment.
Yeah. And like we're talking about this infrastructure bill that has passed the Senate, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. You touched on a little bit of how that language is expanded and whatnot for Buy American. Could you explain some of the other elements of there? My understanding is the percentage of uh, domestic might change over the course of time with this current language. What do we know about the language as it stands right now in that bill?
So these are some of the questions that we've started posing to EPA, and we're going to be reaching out to the Made in America office, because it's very difficult to kind of understand from an implementation perspective. If we have a complex engineered system that has iron and steel, it might have polyester screens, it's made of all kinds of different components. And there's not only the sort of 100% if it's iron and steel, it has to be melted to the coatings here in the
Mhm.
US. But then there's this 55% component test. And so is that 55% of the entire system, or do you pull aside and pull out the iron and steel and then look at what's left and say, of that amount, at least 55% has to be manufactured here in the US? And so, or do you say on a component by component basis? Does each piece have to be looked at as far as whether it's iron and steel 100%, or whether at least 55% is domestically produced? So these are the implementation is really what gets you scratching your head about how
Mhm.
that's going to be um, uh, put in place and what guidance is going to be developed. And I would think that there's going to be a lot more input from the Made in America office, because they've really been tasked with a whole of government approach, and ultimately maybe trying to standardize. So we've also been telling our members to take a really close look at the FAR register notice that just was published on July 30th. And the comment period goes to September 28th. But those are the potential changes that the federal government's looking at for Buy American. So the direct procurement, but to the extent that the direct procurement criteria seem to be now flowing down to everybody else, I think it behooves us to keep an eye on that. And they're looking at the component test over the next 5 years or so being expanded to up to 70%, and potentially cracking down on some of the loopholes that the federal government has put in place over the last 90 years.
Yeah.
So we have to look at all of it, because it's all interrelated, and it all ultimately will impact us in some way.
Yeah. So last question here ties it back into the funding elements. So that we have all this proposed funding in this infrastructure bill, you have this language that potentially expands this stuff. That impacts how that funding can be used, because now if you're calling on that funding, you have to comply with different standards and whatnot. Could you speak to the impacts uh, that has had so far with, like, say, American Iron and Steel, and how that then would impact if that were to be expanded?
Yeah, and that is definitely a big question mark for us. If you look at the funding levels, particularly in this bill for water, for the water sector, they add a number of new programs that are kind of peripheral. They really don't add that much more money
Mhm.
for the drinking water SRFs, clean water SRFs, or WIFIA. So there's marginal increases really in that. So if EPA stance has always been, if $1 of federal funding is put into a project, then the entire project, regardless of where the rest of the $99 come from, um, all have to comply with these requirements. And that's a big question that we have as well. And we understand why they put that in play, but um, that could further exacerbate the situation, well beyond, reasonableness, if an entire project now has to comply with all of these
Mhm.
provisions. So lots of questions, no answers right now, but we think it's really important from the manufacturer's perspective to get this information out to all of our members and others as well in the industry, for them to start to assess what are the potential impacts, learning what could this mean for my company, for my supply chain, for my end products. Can I make some changes now to start thinking about being ready for something like this, which I think potentially is going to happen very quickly.
Hmm.
So, there's been a lot of discussion about sort of the next steps. Well, that Senate bill's gone back to the House, and they've also passed the foundations for that 3.2 trillion reconciliation bill, which the House wanted in order to move on this. And so it's a likely potential scenario that the House might just take the Senate bill, sign it, and move it on to the president.
Hmm.
Because if they open that back up, then it has to go back to conference with the Senate. Then, and a lot of these provisions have been very carefully crafted and negotiated and taken months and months and months to get to.
Hmm.
So it's not untenable to think that the House may just sign it and move it. And that could then happen very quickly. So we need to be cognizant of how quick that could happen and start really looking at what the impacts could be, and if we've got some alternatives or some changes that we can start to implement today. And certainly the education piece is real critical, for EPA, for the Made in America office, for Congress, to just understand what the potential unintended consequences of this are, and just know what could happen. And the question for us would be, is the federal government prepared to provide and ensure that we have the capacity to meet these new requirements that they're now putting on us?
Hmm. Yeah.
So
All this funding, there are some strings still attached to it, kind of thing.
yes, yes.
Uh,
So it's going to be Army Corps, it's going to be USDA. I mean, it's every federal agency.
mhm.
So you're not going to find carve outs anywhere
Yeah.
for funding. So we're all in this together right now.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. I really appreciate you taking this deep dive with me and kind of getting a better lay of this land and what we can kind of expect currently and potentials for things as well. So your insights are truly helpful for stuff like this, and I really lean on you a lot for understanding some of this language.
Oh, absolutely. We just feel like it's very important, and a critical role for our association to play, and just the educating and understanding, what the potential changes are, and helping our industry be prepared, for any eventuality.
Mhm. We'll have some links in the description for this video interview down below so you can see some more about WEMA and some of the resources they've got on this. And thank you once again, Vanessa. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Absolutely, Bob. Pleasure as always.